What if a single act of kindness could transform an entire community? Discover the incredible story of how a neglected rose became a symbol of hope and connection for everyone involved. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Flow, where every story brings a new perspective. Let's get started. Lucas Hart was not the type of high school junior who slept in on weekends. At 17, he was an early riser, drawn to the calm of dawn and the familiar rhythm of his sneakers hitting the pavement in his neighborhood. But recently, something new had been catching his attention on these morning runs. A few blocks down from his own house stood an old ranch-style home with a garden that had long gone dry and desolate, its beds filled with cracked soil and faded plants. Yet amidst the dead patches, a single rose, though drooping and pale, had somehow managed to survive. It poked out defiantly from the dirt, like a whisper from the past. One morning, as Lucas paused to catch his breath, he looked at the rose and felt an urge to water it. He unscrewed his sports bottle and let a few drops trickle over the parched soil around it. He repeated this act each day, finding himself drawn to that wilted rose, hoping that his small effort might help it perk up. After a week of this new routine, Lucas noticed that the flower seemed a little less wilted, its petals a bit less droopy. He was admiring the subtle change when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Thank you for caring." Lucas turned, startled, to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She looked to be in her 70s, her silver hair pulled back neatly. Her face was creased with years, but softened by a warm smile. "I didn't mean to intrude," Lucas said quickly, feeling awkward. I thought I could use a little water." The woman chuckled gently, shaking her head. "No harm done, son. I appreciate it really. That rose bush was my husband's pride and joy. But since he passed 2 years ago, I haven't been able to look after it or the rest of the garden." A twinge of sadness passed over her face, and Lucas felt his heart tighten. "I'm sorry," he said, unsure of what else to offer. The woman sighed, but her smile remained. "I'm Evelyn Henderson. Everyone calls me Mrs. Henderson," she said, extending a hand. Lucas shook her hand, feeling the strength behind her delicate fingers. "Lucas, nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." They stood in silence for a moment, each unsure of what to say next. Finally, Lucas spoke. "If you'd like, I could help bring your garden back. Maybe on weekends? I know a bit about gardening from helping my mom." Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened, and she nodded. "That would mean a lot to me, Lucas. Thank you." That Saturday, Lucas arrived bright and early, armed with gloves, a rake, and a pair of pruning shears he'd borrowed from his mom. Mrs. Henderson greeted him with a smile and a tray of iced tea, dressed in a simple hat to shield her from the sun. They spent the day working side by side. Lucas pulled weeds, cleared dead plants, and carefully tended to the rose bush, all while Mrs. Henderson told him stories about her husband, Henry, and the life they'd shared in the house. Henry was a teacher. Mathematics, she said proudly. He taught at the local high school for over 30 years. This garden was his retreat after long days with rowdy kids. It was where we'd spend hours together, planting flowers and talking about everything and nothing. Lucas listened, captivated, feeling the weight of each memory she shared. As they worked, he realized that their task was more than just reviving a garden. It was honoring Henry's memory. By midday, the garden looked slightly less forlorn. Lucas could see potential beneath the dead foliage, a hidden beauty waiting to be uncovered. The following Saturday, Lucas returned, and to his surprise, he wasn't alone. Mrs. Whitaker, an older neighbor and retired schoolteacher, had heard about the project and offered her own gardening tips. Soon after, Mr. Wilson, a retired landscaper who lived 2 streets down, showed up with mulch and compost. What started as a quiet gesture between Lucas and Mrs. Henderson began attracting attention. Neighbors dropped by, some offering plants, others bringing cold lemonade or small snacks for the group. Children came to watch, their curiosity piqued by the transformation taking place. With each new addition to the garden, Mrs. Henderson seemed to regain a bit of her former vitality. Her laughter grew louder, and her stories filled the air like music. The garden became a sanctuary, a place where people could connect in simple, meaningful ways. As the weeks passed, Lucas organized small events in the garden. They held reading hours for children, and coffee mornings where the older residents of the neighborhood could chat and share their own stories. Slowly but surely, the garden became a cherished community space. One day, Mrs. Henderson had an idea. "I think we should plant a memory tree," she said, a glint of excitement in her eyes. "A memory tree?" Lucas asked, intrigued. "Yes," she nodded, smiling. "We could plant a young tree right here in the center of the garden. Anyone who's lost someone, or who wants to remember something meaningful, can tie a ribbon to one of its branches." Lucas loved the idea. They selected a small oak tree, and with help from Mr. Wilson, they planted it at the heart of the garden. They tied the first ribbon together, a small purple one to honor Henry's memory. Over time, more ribbons appeared. Red, blue, green, each one symbolizing a story, a person, or a cherished memory. The garden, once desolate, was now filled with life, color, and laughter. It had become a place of solace, a living reminder of how community could transform not only a space but the people within it. One morning, Lucas noticed a few reporters from the local news station talking to Mrs. Henderson. The garden project had attracted attention, and the town council had decided to honor it with a small feature in the community newsletter. Lucas listened as Mrs. Henderson explained the story of how a simple act of kindness, water for a single rose, had blossomed into something so much larger. In the days that followed, the council announced a plan to fund similar community gardens in other neighborhoods. Lucas felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that his small gesture had sparked something meaningful. Yet, even with the town's recognition, Lucas felt his most important achievement was his friendship with Mrs. Henderson. They had both healed in some way, bound by the shared purpose of reviving not only a garden, but a spirit of compassion and connection. The garden continued to thrive, but what blossomed most was the friendship between Lucas and Mrs. Henderson. Lucas would stop by after school some days, just to say hello, and Mrs. Henderson always had stories to share about Henry's early teaching days, the travels they'd dreamed about, and the life they'd built together. Over time, the once quiet garden became the center of the neighborhood, a place where people gathered, laughed, and shared their lives. The memory tree they'd planted was now heavy with colorful ribbons, each one representing a story or tribute to a loved one. Mrs. Whitaker, the retired schoolteacher, had tied a pink ribbon to honor her late sister, while Mr. Wilson had added a blue ribbon for his son, who had moved across the country. As the tree grew, so did its significance, a reminder of the memories woven into the community. News of the Garden of Remembrance had spread throughout the small town. Inspired by the neighborhood's dedication, the town council decided to support more community-led initiatives. Soon, other neighborhoods began transforming vacant lots and neglected spaces into community gardens. Inspired by Lucas and Mrs. Henderson's project, people across town were beginning to see these green spaces as more than just plants and flowers. They were places for connection, reflection, and healing. One Saturday, a small ceremony was held at the original garden. The town's mayor attended and gave a short speech, thanking Lucas and Mrs. Henderson for their efforts in bringing the community together. Mrs. Henderson stood beside Lucas, looking both proud and humbled. For her, this garden wasn't just a project. It was a testament to the love she had shared with Henry and the kindness she'd experienced through Lucas and her neighbors. As the mayor wrapped up his speech, he unveiled a plaque that read, "In honor of those we've loved and lost, and for those who remind us of the power of kindness. May this garden continue to grow as a symbol of hope, memory, and community." The crowd erupted in applause, and Lucas noticed tears in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. She squeezed his hand tightly, and he understood that this garden had not only brought new life to the neighborhood, but had also brought peace to her heart. With the garden project completed, Lucas found himself reflecting on what it meant to him. His initial motivation had been simple, helping a neglected flower. But the friendships he'd formed, the stories he'd heard, and the change he'd witnessed had left a lasting impact. He began to think about what he wanted to do with his future. Inspired by Mrs. Henderson's stories of Henry's work as a teacher, Lucas realized that he wanted to pursue something where he, too, could help people. Lucas started volunteering at a nearby youth center, mentoring younger kids, and helping with after-school activities. He He organized gardening workshops, sharing what he'd learned from the project, and taught the kids about the importance of kindness, resilience, and community. One afternoon, he told Mrs. Henderson about his new role, and her face lit up with pride. "Henry would be so proud of you," she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You have a good heart, Lucas. Never lose that." As months passed, the garden continued to be a cherished spot. It became a place for birthday gatherings, quiet moments of reflection, and even community meetings. People from neighboring towns would visit, inspired by the story of how a single act of kindness had transformed an entire community. Lucas often spent his Saturday mornings at the garden, helping maintain the plants and ensuring everything stayed vibrant. The garden was a place of peace for him, a reminder of his journey and the lives he had touched. One day, a young girl approached him, looking up at the memory tree in awe. She held a small, white ribbon in her hand and asked if she could tie it to the tree. She explained in a soft voice that her grandfather had recently passed away and her family hadn't had the chance to say goodbye properly. Lucas knelt beside her and helped tie the ribbon to a low branch, offering a quiet moment of comfort. As he watched her place her hand gently on the ribbon, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The garden had become more than just a collection of plants. It was now a place where people found healing, hope, and a sense of belonging. Mrs. Henderson's health began to decline as the seasons changed. Her visits to the garden became less frequent, and on the days she did come, she would sit on a small bench, watching with a gentle smile as others enjoyed the space she and Lucas had built. She often looked at the memory tree, filled with ribbons, as if each one carried a part of her own story. One crisp autumn morning, the community received the news that Mrs. Henderson had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Lucas felt a deep sadness, as though he had lost a member of his own family. The garden had lost one of its founders, and for a moment, it felt like a piece of the magic had faded. In the days that followed, the neighborhood came together to honor Mrs. Henderson's memory. A small white ribbon was tied to the memory tree, symbolizing the love and warmth she had brought to so many. Lucas, with the support of the community, arranged a gathering at the garden where everyone shared their memories of her. There were tears, but also laughter, as neighbors recounted stories of her kindness, resilience, and the beauty she had brought to their lives. As the sun set that evening, Lucas sat quietly on the bench, reflecting on how much Mrs. Henderson had meant to him. He thought back to the first day he'd watered that lonely rose and how that simple act had led to something extraordinary. The garden continued to grow, its legacy carried on by Lucas and the community. Inspired by Mrs. Henderson's vision, Lucas started a foundation to help other neighborhoods create spaces of remembrance and healing. Each new garden planted in her honor bore a small plaque with her name and the words, "For those we love, and for those we have lost." Years later, Lucas returned to the original garden, now thriving and cared for by new hands. He walked up to the memory tree, now strong and tall, with ribbons still fluttering in the breeze. Among the many ribbons, he found the one he had tied for Mrs. Henderson, slightly faded but still there, a testament to the bond they had shared. As he stood there, he realized that the garden had not only brought healing to the neighborhood, but had also shaped his life. It was a reminder of how small acts of kindness, when nurtured, could blossom into something that changes lives, leaving an impact that lasts long after we're gone. With a smile, he whispered a quiet thank you to Mrs. Henderson and Henry, knowing that their spirits lived on through every petal, every memory, and every ribbon tied to that tree. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Remember, even the smallest gestures can make a huge difference. See you in the next video.